I had this very visible public watershed moment in my life when I was on board a small spaceship and we undocked from the space station and went through the wild physical experience of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and thundering down through and flames licking around the ship and 3,000 degrees outside, and then the parachute opening just before you hit the ground and then slamming into the world and rolling to a stop. And then you sort of emerge almost newborn out of that ship with now my astronaut career essentially completed, but still a lot of my life left. So it's a real good moment to take stock and think, what do I want to do now? What excites me and thrills me and what challenges me? And maybe more importantly, what is it that I want to accomplish?
Hi, Chris. Welcome to Bookends. Thank you so much for coming in.
I've been really looking forward to talking with you. So thanks for the welcome.
I want to start with the beginning of your career as an author. When the Apollo murders came out in 2021, you and your wife, Helene, spoke with the New York Times, and she actually said that becoming an author was always part of the plan for post-astronaut life. Why was that?
It was my favorite subject in school. It was the thing I think I had sort of the most intuitive knack for. I loved reading. I loved writing. I wrote poetry. I wrote short stories. I wrote a book of limericks. I just found the study of language and the manipulation of language and the ability to share ideas through written word really interesting. And it's where I learned most of the things that I knew. And so I always wanted to write. But I knew if I took like a English lit degree, they wouldn't let me command a spaceship. So I just deferred it. But as I was approaching my third space flight, and I'd already been an astronaut for almost 2 decades, and I'd been a combat fighter pilot, a test pilot, and all the other things. I had spoken in thousands of places and schools all across Canada and around the world, and I was starting to realize that not just space stories, but the ideas and the traits and the habits that allow space stories to occur were of value to people. And so I thought, what's the best way to coalesce those that other people can have access to ideas and my lessons learned, rather than me having to show up with a PowerPoint and present it to 200 people. And so that was the genesis of my first book. And one day while Helena and I were out walking the dogs, I thought, An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. That's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really grateful for the time to do it, but also the impact that book has had.
Mm-hmm. So that was your foray into nonfiction writing, as you say, kind of sharing some of your experiences, things that you would have been perhaps asked to speak about if you were going to give a talk at a school, at a conference. But then you did this pivot into fiction, which is something a bit different, I would say, for somebody of your background. Was it daunting for you at all, or more of an exciting challenge to, I guess, turn your craft to fiction writing with the first Apollo murders book?
I can't speak for anyone else, but I don't know if you find challenges exciting, but I do. To be challenged to do something that I think I just might barely be able to do and that accomplishes something I think is worthwhile, that's how I conduct my life. That's how I've chosen to do everything in my life. And so the challenge of perhaps writing fiction, which I love reading fiction, and the type of fiction that I was most transported by was, kind of thriller, engrossing stories that I could only imagine. I always escaped through those, and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to try and tell the same sort of stories that I've been telling at conferences and in my nonfiction books, but try and write them through a fiction style. And it was a big challenge, and I had a lot of learning to do. There's a backstory that might be interesting to you. I was approached sort of out of the blue by Ray Bradbury's family. And for the folks that don't know, Ray was a terrific science fiction author of the 40s and 50s. And he wrote a book about Mars in 1949 called The Martian Chronicles. It was a really interesting moment in history. It was after the atomic bomb, but before Sputnik. So before anything had been launched into space, but we had already just come through World War II and all that wanton destruction. And one of the best telescopes in the world had seen things on Mars that looked like canals.
Mm.
He took those facts and that public ethos at the time and wrote a really beautifully written book The family asked me when they were going to re-release the book, the Bradbury family, to write a long intro to it. And I thought, well, that's a new thing for me to do, but it sounds interesting. And besides, it'd be nice to reread the Martian Chronicles. So I said I'd do it. And I reread the book. I did a bunch of research. I had a take on it that I thought would be sort of interesting as an introduction. And wrote the best introduction I could, maybe 3,000 words, so a fairly lengthy intro. The family loved it, but a publisher in the UK read that intro and contacted me and said, I'm sure you could write fiction. If you wrote that all by yourself, I'm pretty confident you could write fiction. And he said, I've got this idea for a book. I think it should be called The Apollo Murders. And I don't know, some people go to the moon and some die. I don't know what's going to happen. But if you'll do it, then we'll publish it. And we don't really care when, and we'll give you an advance. So I'm like, okay. Well, that kind of gave me launch. But I didn't get around to it for a long time until eventually they all noticed I wasn't writing this book yet, and my wife said he needs a deadline. So the publisher gave me a deadline, and then the pandemic arrived, and so suddenly I had time and place to write The Apollo Murders, and it was a huge effort and experiment, and I had a lot of learning to know how to efficiently write fiction. But that book has done superbly well, and it's in 15 languages and optioned for TV and movies. So it was very heartening and has given me the confidence to write this newest one, Final Orbit.
It's interesting, like these three thrillers are set in the 70s during the space race. It's a period of heightened tension in the Cold War, but it's also a period where the United States and the Soviet Union are trying to reach a sort of détente of, can we maybe cooperate? Can we coexist despite being still arch enemies? What is interesting to you about that period of time as a fiction writer?
It was those things you just mentioned, but it was much more. It was the Vietnam War, which was a moment of extreme self-analysis and angst and regret within the United States, and a lot of really strong conflicting opinions. It was race riots in the U.S., wild, crazy race riots, in the afterflow of Woodstock and the whole hippie period of the U.S. It was the rise of women's rights, then becoming entrenched in law. It was Watergate, with the corruption of the U.S. presidency and the slow public disgracing and downfall of Nixon. So all of those factors were going on under the great tension of the Cold War, where thousands of nuclear weapons were pointed on a hair trigger in between the two greatest powers in the world. And somehow, in 1975, the two big superpowers used the very last Apollo ship and one of the Soviet Soyuzes to try and do a demonstration of optimism, a demonstration of, hey, we can actually cooperate, even though there's all these incredible disruptors. And that was, the Americans called it Apollo Soyuz, the Soviets called it Soyuz Apollo, which is understandable. But just to have a friendly, cooperative handshake somewhere besides Earth, showing that maybe there is a way for us to get along. And that combination of the time and that moment gave me a lot of room to write this new book, Final Orbit.
I want to talk actually a little bit more about that specific setting for Final Orbit in particular, because Final Orbit is set in July 1975 during, as you say, a real mission that did take place. You obviously take some liberties and create these disastrous scenarios that these astronauts and cosmonauts have to confront. But it was this first space mission manned by an international crew. It was deemed successful, this handshake in space between the two countries. What went into that mission taking place, and what's the long tail of it? Because it seems like that laid the groundwork, perhaps, for a lot of the later collaborations we've seen between different countries, doing research together in space, doing joint missions.
It came out of slow backroom conversations between Soviet upper-level personnel and American upper-level personnel. And it took 5 years of work, led by Glyn Lunny of NASA, who figures in the book, and a whole host of other people, not just for the more predictable parts of how do you even dock two ships together that don't have compatible docking mechanisms? How do you communicate when we don't use the same frequencies? Or languages? And how is mission control in Moscow going to talk to mission control in here? How are we going to do all those things? That was complicated enough. But also just the shift of geopolitics and purpose and convincing all the people at all the various levels that this was a worthwhile endeavor. And so it was a long developmental process. And there were a lot of potential ways to do it along the way. Maybe they would launch the Apollo and it would dock with one of the early Soviet space stations called Salyut that were up there. But eventually we just decided simply on a Soyuz and Apollo docking together. They chose extremely experienced crews on both sides, and managed in July of '75 to, as you say, successfully dock and undock and demonstrate that, yeah, even in times of darkness, there are rays of light.
Hmm. So, as we've been saying, this is based on a real mission that did occur, but you're also bringing in your own fictional characters to the scene to create some of the drama, propel the plot along. I want to talk about this main character who appears throughout the series, Kaz Zemeckis. He's a flight controller. He's all around just kind of a badass, like American NASA guy, right? He's a military background. He has kind of a cool sounding name, even. I mean, Zemeckis to me, I think Robert Zemeckis, the director, I don't know if that's at all inspirational to the name. He's lost an eye from a collision with a bird while flying a plane. Like, where did you come up with this guy?
I don't know how other authors choose characters. I visualized what type of person I wanted. And then what I do is I just start scanning faces on the internet. And I go, okay, yeah, that's sort of the person I was looking for. And then I go into, okay, well, what background produces a face like that? And oddly enough, this person I chose the image of was a Lithuanian Jew. And so I thought, okay, great. And that's very credible. A lot of them left Lithuania in the 30s, before the war and all of the Nazi problems and horrific things that happened, and would have come to the United States. And this guy would have been born in the 30s to be flying in the 60s and 70s, so perfect. And then I just scroll through like family histories looking for a name. Okay, what is a typical name of a Lithuanian Jew? And so Zemeckis. So it had nothing to do with
Yeah.
Robert Zemeckis. This is just okay. And you need to have an American name, but it needs to be ethnically representative. So Kazimierz Zemeckis, great. Kaz, perfect. Kaz. And you need a name as your main character that people can remember, and that's distinct. And you also need a main character that is flawed. Otherwise, they're going to be boring. Even Superman came from another planet, and kryptonite did him in. Superman wasn't perfect. So I drew on a thing that happened to me, but and another thing that happened to another pilot friend of mine, and decided I'm going to take out one of Kaz's eyes in a flying accident. And with that, then he is a perfect person with all the skills who could do any of the jobs, but now because of his missing one eye, he's not allowed to. So he's very portable as a character. I can now transport him into a bunch of different scenarios where he would be a logical guy to go in because of his skill set, but he couldn't actually be the guy doing it. And then other characters, once I had him and I had the era that I wanted to write in, then it's a matter of digging through history, finding incredible realities, and then building a few more of my fictional characters, and then weaving them into the actual history of what went on. If things had gone slightly differently, this could have happened. And that's the way I write all my fiction.
Hmm. I do want to get into the level of historical detail, but before that, I would be remiss to not ask more about the flying accident. Yeah, because you mentioned that this sort of flying accident that's in Kaz's background is based off of a story, something that happened to you and something that happened to a friend of yours. What was your flying accident story?
I was a test pilot. Every airplane anybody ever flies in has been tested thousands of times by a specially qualified and trained type of pilot. And test pilot school is like a year. It's like a PhD in flying, extremely technical, complex, and operational. So I was qualified as a test pilot. While I was flying as a test pilot on exchange with the United States Navy, one of the things we were testing on an airplane was its way it senses speed and altitude. And one of the ways you do that, it sounds pretty weird, but you fly at an exact altitude above the water. And this is over the Chesapeake Bay, exact altitude above the water. And then you just go at first 200 knots and then 250, then 350. And you go by a little sighting tower. And the technicians in the sighting tower watch you come by. And at the moment you go by all their sensors, you record what all your instruments show and they record what was happening externally. And from that, they can then calibrate your whole system. So it's old fashioned, but it works. It's called a tower flyby. I was doing the top speed tower flyby, 550 knots. So, 9 miles a minute, really ripping across the water. And I'm coming exactly down this line that you need to fly by. And there's a countdown so the guys in the tower can be ready with their data. And so it's like ready, mark. And there are these lines or these towers in the water underneath it you can line up with. And so you hit the first tower, ready, second tower, ready. As I hit the first tower, ready, I saw something in my windscreen in the distance, in my heads-up display. When I said the second ready, I realized it was a seagull. And I'm going 550 knots, like covering speed you hardly even understand. And just as I was about to hit the seagull, because the seagull made the fatal mistake of diving, which would work for most things, but not an F-18 going that fast. And it tucked its wings, and rather than have it come directly through my windscreen, which was going to happen, I just flinched the airplane to the right, and I heard it bang off the side somewhere on my airplane. I thought it went down my left engine. So what do you do now? So I thought, okay, I probably lost my left engine. He didn't kill me. I pulled my left engine to idle, zoomed up because I had all this speed, so I get up nice and high, declared an emergency, came around, went back, landed on the runway at that Patuxent River. A friend of mine flying F-86s under similar circumstances got hit by a bird. It came through the windscreen and actually smashed into his face and took out his left eye. And he then had to cover his eye and turn his head so the wind blast would blow the blood out of his good eye so he could see the ground well enough to be able to land, and managed to get his airplane back on the ground, an F-86 Sabre. And after that, his call sign was Cyclops from then on. But and so I took his story, and then I took my F-18 story, and I combined the two of them in order to injure Kaz and set him up for the rest of the series.
Wow. It's such rich detail. Like you can see like how you manage to write thrillers, because even just verbally telling these stories of your days as a test pilot, this thing that happened to your friend, I'm like on tenterhooks hearing about the bird and like how did you get out of this situation. There's also a
Oh, I
lot
didn't tell you one thing.
oh my God,
Where
okay,
the bird
please.
hit the airplane, we couldn't find where the bird hit the airplane. I'm going, I heard it hit the airplane. The technicians crawled all over it. We said, well, we're going to fly it first thing tomorrow morning. I was like, man, there's damage somewhere. In the morning, the technician climbed up on the back of the F-18, and the F-18 has two vertical tails at the back. And the overnight dew had collected on the airplane, and he saw that it was weird. It was reflecting light strangely off the inside of the left tail. And when he went back and looked in detail, that seagull had hit there and collapsed the whole structure of the left tail of the Hornet, the F-18, and we had to like rebuild that whole part of the airplane. So I'm glad he found it before anybody else took that airplane flying. But that provided all the genesis for the story, but also it gave me a protagonist that I could really manipulate around.
Well, in your stories, these are stories that are so rich with technical detail and specifics. You know, in your novels, you're also drawing on history, you're drawing on real people, real events. And yet you manage to make it understandable for people who have no technical background in space, flying, really anything. Like I have very limited scientific knowledge in any field, and I felt able still to follow the story. How did you manage to strike that balance of including all of this detail to make it feel very real and lived in, while also making it digestible perhaps for people who don't have the years of technical knowledge and experience that you do?
There's an implied compliment there that I very much appreciate, because I try and really do what you just said to the best of my ability, whether I'm giving a public talk or whether I'm writing a book. I think an important backstop to that, though, is the machines are characters in the life of a pilot or an astronaut. The machine isn't just a house, but the machine is a living, breathing thing that has all of these complex guts and organs and behavioral characteristics that if they don't work right, you all die. And so for an astronaut, the spaceship is an entity, and how it behaves is going to determine your life and your mission success. So that's why the details really matter, because if something starts to go wrong on the ship, that's going to change everything that's going to happen. And also, of course, it provides room for plot.
Mhm.
So, for me, it's absolutely critical to mention those things because that's a big part of an astronaut's life. But also, I have to describe them in a way that someone who isn't of my particular set of interests can get the feel of it, can understand it well enough. How is this actually going to kill you, or why is this a threat, or what are you actually worried about at this time? And I think about it all the time, and I tend to read those sections out loud. Uh, but I've also spoken in thousands of places in schools and people from all ages, and I have tried to develop a vocabulary and a way of describing things that um, that people intuitively get, no matter what age. And so I try and do that in my writing also.
Chris, we've been speaking a bit about story, and I want to dive into some of the plot, I guess, of Final Orbit as much as we can without getting into spoiler territory.
Sure.
But in Final Orbit, once this joint mission between the Americans and the Soviets is underway, your imagination takes over when there's an incident on board that leaves some of the astronauts quite imperiled. Then there's also a secret Chinese space launch that comes into the fray. Why did you want to introduce geopolitical tension to this story that also has this very human element of just like there's people in danger?
I find real life days more interesting if there's more than one thing going on. And and I find stories more interesting if there are multiple plots that you don't even know how they're going to cross yet, right? You're watching this and going, what does that have to do with that? Um, and introducing a few more characters in and gives you another whole perspective to look at the same event and describe it to the reader. And so the beauty of the summer of 75 is all those things were happening or had happened recently. So I could take a space accident like the one that you alluded to and work that into this book, but then also the nascent Chinese space program and their astronaut program and work that into the story. And so I'm not satisfied with just one storyline. And none of the good books that I've read, none of those authors were either.
Mhm. I want to dive a bit more into the Chinese element of all of this because, to be completely honest with you, the Chinese space program, I did not realize that it was so old. Like, I was not really aware, I think. I don't want to say until reading this book, but when I think of the period of time that we describe as the space race, I don't think of China as being involved in it at all. I think of it as purely an American and Soviet phenomenon. But as you describe in this book, that's really not true. What was going on with the Chinese space program at the time that you describe in this novel, and why did you want to dive into that in particular, I guess, as a thing to research and include in this novel?
Uh, the Chinese started working on their space program in the 1950s, same as the Soviets launched Sputnik in the 50s. The Americans launched their first rockets in the 1950s. The Chinese industrial base wasn't as advanced as the Soviet one or the American one, so they were pushing it. But they did develop rockets in the 1960s, and they started launching their first orbital rockets in the late 60s and early 70s. They had thousands of applicants. They selected a bunch that went into secret evaluation. They had whittled it down to the final group. They started designing the Chinese spaceship that they were going to fly in. They built the ships that were going to be communicating, and so they could deploy them to the oceans of the world so the ship could talk back to China from orbit. They built an entire medical institute to study what was going to happen physiologically. All that was going on secretly in China at this time in the late 60s and early 70s. And hardly anybody in the Western world knows about it or even knew about it at the time. But so this was great fertile land to try and include in the book, especially because what's going on now. When you look at the dominance of the American and Chinese space programs, Russia has much diminished, and China is hugely ascendant and launches after SpaceX, they launch more things into orbit than anybody. They've landed on the moon with robots multiple times. They brought back samples of the far side of the moon. They have a communication satellite orbiting the moon, getting ready for when people are landing on the moon. Chinese astronauts, they have an extremely robust space program. But this is where it started. This is where it came from. And so I accelerated a little bit for the book, but it was completely credible and actually happening.
Hmm. It's interesting, especially the way that you draw that connection to kind of present day. I guess, why do you think it's important to maybe look back at some of this history to understand what the landscape is in terms of space exploration now?
I, th- I think if you don't understand history, then today is always overwhelming because how can you possibly deal with the huge onslaught of troubles that exist right now if you think that this has never happened before? You just get drowned in a waterfall of unsolvable problems. But if you can realize that we've been through stuff like this before. Uh, all these players have been at this table before. This isn't new. And the only reason it seems overwhelming is because you are one of the current adults having to deal with it. But previous generations of adults have dealt with something very similar. And I find great comfort in that, especially when I'm despairing at extremes of current behavior. It's really comforting to know that life has always been hard. Technology has always been uh, complex and not necessarily trustworthy. And we have somehow managed to find a way through all these things. And so to read a fiction book set in 1975 that carries a lot of mirrors for what's happening today, hopefully gives people a different perspective on the reality and maybe the motivations of each of the players, both at a national level and at a personal level. Why were they doing these things in 1975 might be an unlocking key to why they're doing some of those things now.
Mm. I want to dive a bit more into one specific character that we haven't yet spoken about, and that's Major Svetlana Gromova, who is this flight engineer on board Soyuz in your novel. And this is one of the characters that you introduce who was not really part of the real Apollo Soyuz mission. She's this tough, capable, strong woman. Why did you want to write from the perspective of a female astronaut at this time?
When I set out to write The Apollo Murders, the first book in the series, I didn't have a female character because, as you say, it was pretty unusual. They had a cosmonaut, Svetlana Savitskaya, who was a lot of things that the Svetlana in my book is, who was a military officer and world champion aerobatic pilot, and a real badass of a human being, and living in a 100% man's world. And Russian cultural norms are very much patriarchal. And so I included her in the Apollo Murders, and everything she did, I was fascinated by. Once I'd created this character, she kept having a perspective that surprised me. Great character to have. I'd set up the situation, and then Svetlana would do that, and I'd go, "Oh, of course she'd do that. She'd be the only one to recognize that that's what should go on." And so she's with me all the time. Svetlana is like this little voice beside me, watching what I'm doing and telling me when I'm behaving like an idiot. And she's a completely credible cosmonaut character from the period. And she provides a terrific contrast to the entirely 100% male American program at the time. So I think it makes the story more interesting and it's representative of reality.
Hmm. Why do you think that is, that she's the character that kind of is able to maybe see through some, I guess, like fallacies almost that other characters might be prone to, or even kind of have a new analysis of a situation that surprises you as the author who's created her as a character?
When you're asked to be an astronaut, the skill set used to be fairly uniform. In order to operate a complicated aerospace vehicle under dangerous circumstances with a finite amount of time and fuel and a lot of pressure, who are you going to hire? And they decided to hire test pilots because that's what test pilots do for a living. And it's a small, self-selected, very highly trained group. So they don't have to start from scratch training astronauts. But if you only hire U.S. military test pilots, there's a lot of uniformity, not just in skills, but in thinking. So by introducing a pretty unusual test pilot and one of the rare female test pilots and a Russian test pilot who obviously had to rail against her own system to even get that far. Had a whole different view on things, but still managed to thrive because of her innate abilities. It allowed me then to have a whole different vantage point on the same situation. And there are astronauts like that right now in the astronaut corps who are not your sort of cookie cutter astronaut. These come from a different background. And I've learned over the years their perspectives, because they're fresh and different, are often extremely valuable when everyone else is sort of group thinking because without even knowing it. So having Svetlana there gave me room for differing opinions and sardonic observations and a different set of personal problems and objectives. And that was really helpful in writing an interesting plot.
Hmm. I want to pivot now to something a little bit different, which is some of the praise that you've received for your fiction writing and for the Apollo Murders series. Big names have really praised this work, which I don't know. I imagine it must feel nice as an author.
It feels like surreal, but yeah.
Yeah, well, one of those names being James Cameron, who called the Apollo Murders nail biting. What did it mean to you to receive that kind of recognition?
Well, it's like it's hard to believe, right? I mean, James. I mean, he's from Ontario, and he grew up around Niagara Falls, and a real self-made guy. Went down to California and was driving a truck, but auditing classes at UCLA to learn how to make cool movies, and then made fantastic movies. You know, he's a real driven, focused kind of guy. And what he's doing now with Avatar is to try and use his ability to create these fantasy worlds to actually shift world public opinion on certain issues. And how we think about ourselves and how we think about the environment and climate and things. It's kind of an interesting life that he's leading, but a great storyteller. Watch Terminator, you know, holy cow, or all the other things that he's made. He's a real guy who understands tension and character differentiation and such. So when I, trepidatiously sent him a copy of the Apollo Murders, it was just so delightful. He came back and said, I love this, and I would really like to make it into a film, but I'm kind of busy with this Avatar project right now. But gosh, I really think this would make a blockbuster movie. And so I said, gosh, could you, just write something and I'll stick it on the cover because it's a huge compliment. And Frederick Forsyth loves my book and said great things. And I just kind of shake my head like that's, I've had a lot of weird, amazing things happen in my life, and boy, this definitely is on the top of that cake.
Mm. You alluded earlier when we were chatting before the start of this interview that this is perhaps not the last we're going to hear of Kaz Zemeckis. He is this protagonist that, readers have really become attached to, I think, and he has a bit of an open-ended ending, I would say, at the end of Final Orbit. It's not clear where his journey is going to take him. Is his story over? Do you see a future for him? What are your thoughts about writing another book in this series, taking Kaz's adventure further?
Uh, in between thoughts, I'm often contemplating that exact question. When I'm going for a walk or when I'm in between meetings or all the other stuff I'm up to in my life. And a cool plot idea will pop into my head. And I send myself a note immediately. And I have this steadily collecting file under the next book block in my email. And there's almost enough there for a story now. So I've got some really cool adventures in plan for Kaz and Svetlana and JW. There's something coming. But the hard work is of course the actual writing of the book, and that's all still to come. But yes, so the adventures of Kaz Zemeckis are not complete.
Well, outside of writing, you've worked many jobs, worn many hats, and continue to. You've been a musician, you do a lot of public speaking engagements, you sit on a number of boards. You've even worked with King Charles on sustainability issues in space. What is next for you? I guess what projects generally are you finding inspiring these days?
Part of the question is, why do you do anything? And I had this very visible public watershed moment in my life when I was on board a small spaceship, and we undocked from the space station and went through the wild physical experience of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and thundering down through and flames licking around the ship and 3,000 degrees outside, and then the parachute opening just before you hit the ground and then slamming into the world and rolling to a stop. And then you sort of emerge almost newborn out of that ship, with now my astronaut career essentially completed, but still a lot of my life left. So it's a real good moment to take stock and think, what do I want to do now? What excites me and thrills me, and what challenges me? And maybe more importantly, what is it that I want to accomplish? And when I tried to boil it down, my son actually challenged me, said, Dad, just write yourself a mantra. Like, what is it you're actually trying to do here? And use it as your litmus test all the time for what I'm going to choose to do next. And so I thought, okay, I'll try that. So I wrote it down. And what I decided was I want to try and influence things so that I'm improving the life for as many people as possible in a sustainable way. Simple mantra. And you got to make a living, so not everything is clean under that. But the non-public boards and the philanthropic work that I do, the technology incubator that I lead to try and develop the technologies we need in order to take care of so many people, the companies that I advise, or the boards that I serve on, the stuff I'm doing with King Charles, as you mentioned, or the House of Lords, all of those things, they all are the result of that moment when I returned back to Earth and sort of refocused my efforts in the direction that I want to go next.
Hmm. Well, I think it's frankly kind of inspirational that like you managed to do so many things. I'm like, my God, I need a mantra to help to help direct my life, perhaps. Chris Hadfield, thank you so much for coming in today. It's been so fascinating talking with you, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Mattea. I've really enjoyed the conversation, getting to know you, someone who has done something so rare and so well, and is such a skilled conversationalist and interviewer. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.